Okay, Maryland Labor History 250 group, welcome back. We have a great podcast that we're doing today with Conor Conneally, and Conor is the museum manager at the B&O Ellicott City Station Museum, and it's a part of the Howard County Board of Park and Rec. And so he's going to be talking about the B&O and the Irish immigrant trackmen who built it. And it's a great moment today where immigration is such a controversy that people forget how much immigrants built this country. So, Conor, welcome.
Welcome, Bill. Thank you for talking to me.
Oh, great to have you. Well, tell us a little bit about how the Irish got here and about the history sort of about the B&O Museum and Railroad rather.
Sure. So the B&O Railroad is historically significant because it was the first American railroad to be chartered in the United States. So it was really a pioneer in a lot of ways. So in February of 1827, the B&O Railroad was chartered in Maryland. And the B&O Railroad was really a reaction to the start of the canal era in America. In 1825, you had the Erie Canal open in New York. And also in 1825, you had the start of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal in Washington, D.C. Now, Baltimore, because of its geographic location, wasn't suitable for building a canal. So a group of leading industrialists and businessmen who were like the kind of civic leaders in Baltimore got together in 1827 to explore the new technology of railroads, which were just getting started in Britain at the time. George Stephenson had opened the Stockton and Darlington Railway in 1825, and they saw this exciting new technology and they thought it could be the solution for Baltimore. So in 1827, the B&O Railroad is founded and chartered as a railroad that will be built going from Baltimore on the eastern seaboard all the way out to the Ohio River in the Midwest. The challenge was no one had built a railroad before in the United States. And the big challenge was who are you going to get the railroad? Who are you going to get to build the railroad? And how are you going to build the railroad? And a lot of that work actually fell onto immigrant labor. So how the Irish really got involved with the B&O Railroad kind of starts from the top. A lot of the founders of the B&O Railroad were of Irish descent. Like some of the wealthiest men in America, like William Patterson, was actually an Irish immigrant. You have also Alexander and George Brown. They were immigrants as well. They originally came from Ulster in the north of Ireland in the early 1800s, and they had made their fortunes in the US. And they really helped start the railroad. Now, when they were building the railroads, they had to find labor to do so. And they basically adopted existing models of how to do public work contracts, which was basically adopting how things were done on canals and major road building projects like the National Road Turnpike. So usually what they did was they had a contractor system, which is kind of like a modern engineering project today, where you would have a bid open for contractors and contractors would bid for building sections of the line. And a lot of these contractors were Irish or of Irish descent, and they were established contractors working with building roads and canals. And this model was adopted for building the railroad. And a lot of these contractors, they recruited or had agents which recruited labor, a lot of them from Ireland in the 1820s. So,
And it was a time when many Irish workers or many Irish families were beginning to leave Ireland.
yeah,
The plague, the hunger, the Ungata were
yeah.
hitting.
So the 1820s and 30s are an interesting time because it's before An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger of the 1840s, which really got started around 1845. In the 1820s and 30s, Ireland is still a country that's facing a lot of food insecurity and a lot of political turmoil and upheaval because of the British taking over Ireland through the Act of Union in the 1800. Ireland is really an economic decline, and because of that, there is a lot of desire for going to the new world. So a lot of young men, usually second sons who weren't likely to inherit land, went to the United States, went to Canada, went to North America looking for work and working on laboring projects like canals, roads and railroads was really a major source of employment. Between 1828 and 1837, nearly 40,000 Irish people would emigrate to North
Mm.
America. And this was before the massive wave of emigration that would occur in the 1840s and 1850s. It's estimated that around 1830, about 60% of the workforce on the B&O Railroad were Irish or of Irish descent. And this is really because the work wasn't very well paying. It was dangerous. It was difficult. And also this was seen as immigrant labor was seen as a ready renewable source of labor. You have to remember Baltimore was a major port. There was a lot of immigrants coming into Baltimore, and they would basically be recruited right off the boat. They would presumably they would have had connections, networks. They had agents recruiting them to come over, but they would find ready work working for the railroad or for the canal building projects. And this was a good way of earning a pretty steady wage at the time. You could earn up to $10 to $12 a month working on the railroad, which is actually more than you could for working on canals at the time.
But one of the problems was you had to live along the railroad as you went out. And
Yeah,
so
so
their
so
families
basically,
come along and their kids, and it's a very unstable of a life for the families.
yeah, so a lot of the workers on the railroad, because they were building the B&O Railroad, you have to remember the first 13 miles of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad ran between Baltimore and Ellicott's Mills to Ellicott City, where I am today. I'm at the station, which was the original terminus of the first 13 miles of the railroad. The railroad ran through the Patapsco River Valley, which at that point was very undeveloped. It was rough, rural, wild country at the time. And basically, what the railroads workers would do is, as they were building the railroad moving out west, as they were moving through the Patapsco River Valley, they would construct and deconstruct shanty towns along the railroad, basically kind of building, huts or whatever kind of habitation that they could have
Hmm.
whilst they are working. Now, as you can imagine, working in American summers and American winters, very harsh temperatures, very rough conditions, what people in Ireland are likely to expect. Um, it would be very difficult. I actually have a source from a British writer, James Boardman, who actually wrote of the B&O railroad workers in 1830. And he wrote that the temporary wooden cabins, which are erected at different stations on the road, appeared a wild amount of disorder and a total absence of what an Englishman would call comfort. Every hovel had its swarm of children, its barrel of flour, a flitch of bacon, and a stone bottle of the creature, which is whiskey. And whiskey would have been ubiquitous among workers as a cliche, but also as a way
The
of,
Irish stereotype, exactly.
yeah, but you have to remember that building the railroad, how they built the railroad is originally because the railroad technology was in its infancy, they weren't using the kind of modern iron rails that we
Oh.
think of today. They were actually using a type of rail known as strap rail. And how that worked was basically they used huge blocks of granite stone that they would lie as sleepers longitudinally, and they would build rails on top of those. They would haul these massive blocks of stone into place, which would have been incredibly difficult. And they would have to do that for miles and miles, which was difficult work, and it would have been backbreaking work as
Mm-hmm.
well. So very difficult work. And you can see still within the Patapsco State Valley Park, the blocks that were put in place by the first workers of the B&O Railroad. And you can get a sense of the scale of it, how difficult it would have been for them.
Now, where are those blocks located if people want to go
So
find them?
if you're in the Patapsco Valley Park, if you walk along the Gristmill Trail in the Avalon area, if you walk along the trail, it's a lovely walk along the river. You can actually see the original kind of along the railway. You can see the original kind of culverts and that were built by the workers, and you can
Mhm.
still see some of the original stones that were used and put in place in the 1830s. It's really cool.
And you can also see if people live in Baltimore City, the original bridge over New Carrollton
Yeah.
has the huge, beautiful stone arch, which is one of the first places where the first train went, was in that park. And it's still
Yes.
there. And you can
Yeah,
walk
so
underneath it.
you have the Carrollton Viaduct and the Thomas Viaduct, which were huge edifices of stone. They were built as monuments, and they're still standing 200 years later.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
they were largely built by Irishmen. The
Hmm.
Thomas Viaduct was the construction was overseen by an Irish immigrant contractor. His name was John McCartney. He was an Ulsterman who had emigrated to the United States in the 1820s, and he was awarded the contract to build the Thomas Viaduct in 1833, which took 2.5 years of construction. A lot of workers were killed and injured during the building of the viaduct because, OSHA wasn't a thing back then. They didn't
Hmm.
have any health and safety. They were very high heights. Men would fall, they would injure, there were accidents, and this was quite a common occurrence at the time. I have a quote from an accident that occurred in 1829. So in February of 1829, when they were building the embankments of the railroad, a quote from the Niles Weekly Register said that 4 men employed on the 10th section of the B&O Railroad were crushed to death on Thursday morning. Their names are Patrick Hackett, Edward McGurry, Thomas Hughes, and Daniel Rangan, all natives of Ireland. The first was so crushed that he appeared not to have a whole bone remaining. The second had his skull fractured, and the third only had a few slight marks of injury, but had his neck snapped. So that's an example of the kind of accidents and
Yeah.
injuries. And this was very dangerous work, but it was the kind of work that was available to immigrants.
Hmm.
And because the work was dangerous, that's why it was appealing to immigrant laborers arriving in America.
Okay. Well, one of the problems that the Irish workers had during the period of this building was that their contractors were used as private contractors from the B&O, but they often had trouble getting paid because the contractors were marginal. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so with the contractor system, the rail workers weren't directly employed by the railroad itself. They were employed by the contractors, and the contractors they were in charge of overseeing and paying their men. Um, and sometimes these contractors, for whatever reason, they would run out of money. So one example of this occurred actually in June of 1831 at Sykesville, or at that point was known as Sykes Mill, because James Sykes, who had originally set up a mill there, which would eventually evolve into the town of Sykesville. So in June of 1831, a group of Irish workers who were working under a contractor who was a Pennsylvanian man known as Truxton Lyons, they were working, and apparently there was a disagreement, and Truxton Lyons had absconded from the railroad without paying his men. And they owed his men over $2,000 in unpaid wages. So the men working on the railroad said, okay, well, if you're not going to pay us, we're not going to work. And what they did is they reacted with basically forming a mob where they would go and systematically destroy the culverts and a roadway they had already built, damaging the work that they had done basically in a riot. This kind of riot would lead to the deployment of the local sheriff, and apparently there was a mob, and they pulled the sheriff off his horse because they were not happy that they weren't getting paid. And as a result of the local sheriff not being able to control the situation, the Maryland State Militia were deployed to Sykesville. So apologies for that. Were to put down the riot, and this is actually one of the first recorded incidents of military troops being moved by railroad in the United States. They moved Maryland State Militia troops from Baltimore to Sykesville by railroad car, which first time recorded time I'm aware of that would happen. And they put the militia. They basically by that point they rounded up the ringleaders of the riots that were occurring, and they arrested 18 men, and including the ringleader, a man named Hugh Riley. This was seen in the local media at the time as kind of seeing a big outrage, but and it was estimated by the railroad that the damage was substantial, with over $6,000 lost in damages and in time lost. And the railroad would fire all the men involved in the rioting. Now, because of this, the B&O Railroad did change their corporate practices. They changed it that they would not be able to they would not hire any contractors unless they could prove that they had the capital to ensure that they could pay their men. and a relief fund was established for the families of the workers who were out of work because of the disruption of the railroad. And this changed corporate practices at the time. And this is like one example of this. Now, the B&O Railroad, like all railroads, wasn't like, a labor friendly institution. They were concerned about the building and construction of the railroad, which at that time was losing money because it was so expensive to
Hmm.
build. But it is an example of early labor action on the railroad. There's a lot of cliches and kind of and ideas of the fighting Irish, of Irish immigrants, fighting amongst each other, and this did happen a lot. There were faction fighting among workers on the railroad. This was basically workers from Ireland coming from different regions, different traditions.
Different
They
counties,
were,
that's what it was.
yeah, they were fighting for the same
Yeah,
jobs.
yeah,
They were trying to organize themselves. When people came to America, they didn't leave their old rivalries at home with
right.
them. They brought them with them. And you have to remember, Ireland was a very small place. Someone from County Cork in the south of Ireland may have never seen or been to someone from like County Antrim in the north of Ireland. And this led to a lot of regional faction fighting. Which would occur on the B&O Railroad and the C&O Canal on a couple of instances, notably in 1834. Now, this was, there were riots, there were men beating and bludgeoning each other. And this was seen as a kind of like a shock and an outrage at the time. But you have to remember, this was the people working on the railroad were using the tools available to them at the time. And you have to remember, the 1830s was a violent era. And, this is what people used to try and improve their working conditions. This was very early in the kind of idea of organized labor. So this was kind of a way of using their working power to kind of work together. Now, a lot of that was seen as like drunken Irishmen fighting each other, and a lot of contemporary media would have seen that as that. But you also have to remember the context of people working to try and secure better working conditions
Yeah.
for themselves.
But I also think that's why I challenge the use of the word riot and mob and ringleader
Yeah,
to
and
describe
I'm
the.
using these as the sources that were used at the
No, I
contemporary
understand,
time.
and they're used as a negative way, as you see in the morning papers today about the railroad strike on Long Island.
Yeah,
But the Irish brought with them organizing skills from Ireland, where they had tried to organize against the British landlords
yeah,
and to try and get a better life for themselves. And
and
often the demonstrations that they would have or confrontations with the contractors were totally mischaracterized. I mean, the workers had a right to get paid and to be treated well. So it's a great historical lesson of the use of language to promote or to discredit the union movement.
and the challenge is for an historian is a lot of the stories of the Irish people themselves were not written down, were not recorded. Likely
Right.
they were illiterate or they had no means to do so. We don't
Yep.
know what happened to a lot of these people,
Yes.
which is a shame. And you have to work with the historical material you have available to you, which does make it more difficult.
Well, yeah, no,
And
yeah,
yeah,
it's very difficult to go. We wish we could go back in time and do oral histories
yeah,
about
and
what it was like living in a shanty on the edge of the railroad with your wife and children and hoping that things would come better for you.
and
So,
like you have to use your imagination, but the legacy is still there. Like the CSX railroad tracks that are still running outside the station today, they run on the same alignment that was built by the railroad workers in the 1830s.
yeah.
The original bridges, the original kind of track bed, that is still in use today. Their legacy still stands in like stone and in through like even through archaeology as seen in the Patapsco State Park. You can see the remnants of the original railroad that was still built. And that
Hmm.
kind of was the precursor to the huge amount of railroads built in the United States because the B&O kind of kickstarted the railroad revolution. Everyone else in the US saw the potential of railroads. And the problem with the B&O was because they were the first, they had the first mover principle of their technology would get better. So the B&O had to redo a lot of the original work that was built
Yeah.
because it had to be with technology improving.
Well, one of the great things which tied to Baltimore was it the transformation from iron rails to steel rails.
Yeah,
And when the Sparrows Point steel plant opened in the late 1880s, about three-quarters of its production were steel rails. And the iron rails would bend, they were susceptible to heat, susceptible to cold, and often had to be replaced or realigned so that there were gangs out in that period. So,
yeah. And it all
so
that's how what built the United States was
yeah,
steel and iron. And it all started in Ellicott City with Irish guys loading huge granite blocks into place and
yeah.
lining it up so horses could pull the first horse-drawn rail cars over. And the
So,
fact that we can still see that today is pretty inspiring.
so briefly, as we conclude here, tell us about your museum. What's
Sure.
in there and what can people see when they get there?
Yep. So I work for the B&O Ellicott City Station Museum, which is one of the historic sites managed by Howard County Recreation and Parks. So we are an historic site that kind of interprets the first railroad station in the US. So we're in the original 1831 building, and it has been restored to give people an idea of what what the railroad station would have looked like in history. So you can walk through the museum and explore its history there. We also have a model railroad, which depicts the first 13 miles between the B&O Railroad in Ellicott, between Baltimore and Ellicott City. And we also have a caboose that was run on the B&O Railroad. We're painting it today, so it's going to look a lot
Hmm.
fresher than it has in previous years. And the station itself is actually celebrating its 50-year anniversary
Oh,
because it
great,
first opened as a museum in 1976. So now we've been open for 50 years.
great.
So it's a long legacy of maintaining the station's history.
Well, I would also suggest to people if you haven't been to the B&O Railroad Museum or to the Irish Museum across the street, these are all the history of a culture of immigration and of industrialization.
Yeah, and they're
And of
fantastic places. If you love
course,
trains, you'll have a great day at any of them.
yeah, I would also mention for people who are in the area that there is still a town of Relay, which is
Yeah,
halfway between Baltimore City and Ellicott City. And it was called Relay because that was where they changed horses en route to what was Ellicott Mills. And it was the first place in the 1877 railroad strike where workers got off a train and blocked the track. But the history of the B&O is an enormously important to the Baltimore area.
yep.
And it
It,
was the
it built
first of its,
Baltimore.
huh?
It built Baltimore. It was a
Yes.
key
Yeah.
important part of the city.
Okay. And so it's a great story about immigration, about industrialization, about development of unions. And so, Connor, thank you very much.
No,
Appreciate it. I
thank you,
hope
Bill.
that all our viewers will go down to Ellicott City and look at the museum and talk with Connor.
Yeah, it was a pleasure speaking to you, Bill. Thank you very
Okay,
much.
great.